The Stockton-Boudinot family have a really fun connection throughout the American Revolution. Now, before we get too deep, this gentleman next to me is Richard Stockton. Richard Stockton is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And before we get there, we're going to jump back a little bit to the mid-1760s when he goes to Europe to, well, do a variety of things, including complain to King and Parliament about some of the new taxation policies they are passing. While he's there, he runs into another young man who will be important to our story today, Benjamin Rush. At this point, a gentleman who is studying to be a physician over in Edinburgh in Scotland. Stockton and Rush, by the way, Stockton's father, John Stockton, had founded a college then known as the College of New Jersey, what we now today know as Princeton. But the president of that college, Aaron Burr Sr., the father of Aaron Burr, had recently passed away, and they were looking for another president for this particular university. So Stockton and Rush get together, and they say, "Hey, John Witherspoon, would you like to come to America and be the new president of this particular university?" Witherspoon had previously denied the position, but here we are 2 years later. He's getting a personal invite from Richard Stockton and Benjamin Rush saying, "Please come teach at this college. It's really important for us to develop this particular university." Witherspoon, already a preacher, already had taught at several universities, including Edinburgh, and they do convince him to move his family to North America. What is fascinating about this particular conversation is that Stockton, Rush, and Witherspoon, less than a decade later, would all sign the Declaration of Independence. So you have these three future Declaration signers in Scotland having a conversation about a university in New Jersey. So I love that story, and I wanted to bring it up. Witherspoon kind of fades from our story from here on out, but these other two gentlemen, well, they're going to be important. As I said, today's main topic is Richard Stockton and his larger family. So let's pull up the tree. There's Richard Stockton, and over there is Elias Boudinot. Elias Boudinot. I never know if it's Elias or Elias. I do believe it's Boudinot because he is French Huguenot ancestry. His great-grandfather had fled France during some of those trying times and come over to North America. His father was a merchant and a blacksmith, so kind of a upper-level artisan, but lower-level, not quite a member of elite society. Either way, Boudinot does study, he does receive his education, and these men get tied together in a pretty fascinating way. Before we get to their ties, I should say Richard Stockton ends up, as I said, signing the Declaration of Independence. His buddy Elias Boudinot is actually a student of his and studies law under Stockton and then becomes a lawyer himself. During the Revolutionary War, Boudinot would go on to be Commissary General of Prisoners, I believe is the title. Essentially, he was in charge of both British prisoners under American control and American prisoners under British control. And it was his job to try and keep alive the American prisoners who were being held on the British warships, the prison ships off New York City's harbor, and in wretched buildings like the Sugar House. He was the one desperately trying to get them food from New Jersey, which itself was kind of a no man's land and had the most battles of the American Revolution. Now, sadly, eventually in 1777, Richard Stockton's house is captured by the British. And this house is in New Jersey. They both live in New Jersey. But Stockton is able to escape but is later captured, and he is given awful treatment because, he signed the Declaration of Independence and the British knew that. So he is treated very poorly and in fact would suffer such ill health after his confinement that though he was released, he would pass away in 1781 and never actually see independence declared. As for Boudinot, well, he would go on 2 years later to become president of the Continental Congress, during which time the final Treaty of Paris was ratified, and Elias Boudinot actually signs the Preliminary Articles of Peace, which officially end the hostilities of the Revolutionary War. Though it would take another year for the treaty to actually be signed and sent out. That is Boudinot's claim to fame. With that in mind, Why are they both on this semi-family tree? Well, let's see. First, I want to point out that Richard Stockton has a brother, Samuel Wytham Stockton. This little piece here, that is my sibling line. This is marriage and children. This is sibling. So, Samuel Wytham Stockton was actually in London when the Revolutionary War broke out, and he does side with the Patriots. First, he becomes an assistant to William Lee, a member of the famous Lee family of Virginia, and he goes with William over to become William's secretary in Vienna and Berlin, and they try and win Austria-Hungary's and Prussia's support during the Revolutionary War. It takes a while. Eventually they do get Prussia, but not really Austria-Hungary. Then Samuel Wytham Stockton goes over to Denmark before John Adams gets there. I'm sorry, the Netherlands, before John Adams gets there, and works out a treaty with the Dutch, a secret treaty, getting the first financial assistance from the Dutch and really from anyone in Europe, though it's just a little bit. He does get a little bit of help. So that's Samuel Wytham Stockton, super underappreciated. And the reason I created a sibling line is this. First of all, Richard Stockton gets married. And he marries Annis Boudinot. And you'll notice I have my sibling line here because she was the older sister of Richard's student, Elias. Great. Now, Annis Boudinot is a fascinating character. I almost did a whole thing just on her, but we'll do it in brief. She was one of these very well-educated women of society at the time, much better educated than most people. She had a husband who also promoted the idea of women being educated and fairly liberated, not necessarily in the fashion we'd consider today, but certainly for the time. She actually was one of the first women to publish pieces of literature during this time period. She publishes between 20 and 40, though in the mid-1980s, an ancestor of hers donates one of her old books, and she had actually written about 120 different works, all sorts of essays and poems and plays, a wide variety of genres. Just a really impressive woman. And Annis and Richard would have meetings at their house and at other people's houses of their friends of kind of like a literary society of sorts. The most famous name who accompanied them was Francis Hopkinson, who would go on to design the American flag and be the poet and composer who signed the Declaration of Independence. But they had what I've usually seen called the Mid-Atlantic group, which was basically just a group of about 10 people who would meet once a week on the weekends and have a big fun dinner and have these fancy discussions about this and that and all sorts of enlightened topics. Now again, I could go on about Annis all day long, but I will not do that right now. What I will do is say that her younger brother also got married. And who did her brother marry? Well, Hannah Stockton. And if the name Stockton sounds familiar, it's because she was also the sister of Richard and Samuel. So Richard married Elias's sister, and Elias married Richard's sister. They kept it all in the family. Now, as for Hannah Stockton, as you can see in the image here, she's holding a book. She was also very well educated. Hence the reason, Richards was raised in a family. Again, his and her father was John Stockton, who founded the College of New Jersey, aka Princeton. So he was very interested in educating his daughters as well, which makes them just a group of some of the most educated women and smartest, most liberated women in the colonies at the time, and mostly based around Princeton, New Jersey, interestingly enough. Now, they had some children, and their children were also very important to the Revolution. Richard Stockton, named Junior, I suppose I should have written there, though he never is seen as calling himself Junior. His son, Richard, is also very important, becomes a leader of New Jersey, and becomes a United States Senator. And then I do believe, and I meant to bring my notes up when I was doing this, I do believe he was a member of the, pardon me while I double check my notes here. Richard Stockton. Oh, of course I don't have it here. Yes, there he is. He was a member of the House of Representatives later in his career. He was, during the John Adams administration, a United States Senator for 3 years. And, that's right, he was New Jersey's district attorney for several years. He also eventually would run for vice president of the United States of America in 1920, though that did not work out. He has a son, Robert F. Stockton, and now we're going to get a little bit away from the American Revolution here and go into the 1840s. Robert F. Stockton was a Commodore in the United States Navy and is the person who led the invasion of California during the Mexican-American War and won California for the United States, then spent time as military governor of California before himself coming back and serving in the United States House of Representatives. Moving to the next child of Richard and Anise, Lucius Horatio Stockton. Now, Lucius Horatio is a lot of fun. He ends up also serving as an Attorney General and Secretary of State for the state of New Jersey. He doesn't do a whole lot on the federal scene, but John Adams famously, during his lame duck session after Jefferson had been elected to replace him, but while Adams was still technically president, he's famous for putting in his midnight judges, a bunch of justices at the last minute, trying to get ready to screw his old buddy Tommy Jeff. That being said, he also tried to put in a new Secretary of War, and he promoted Lucius Horatio Stockton, who had really no experience in this fashion whatsoever. And interestingly enough, there's a letter we have of Richard, his brother, writing saying, hey, listen, Lucius is not going to accept this position. He was a rabid, I read fanatical was the word used to describe him, Federalist, but he just didn't seem to think trying to squeeze him in as Secretary of War when Thomas Jefferson could just replace him as soon as he showed up anyway was worth his time. Moving even further along, Julius Stockton. Now, there are two other children I left out of here, another daughter and a son who was a preacher. They did not really contribute to the revolution in any way, so I didn't bring them up. Julia Stockton, however, did. She was a member of the Ladies Association. We talked not too long ago about Esther Reed, wife of Joseph Reed, who was president of New Jersey, started the Ladies Association, which was a group of mostly wealthy women who wanted to support the war effort, and they did so by bringing in a whole bunch of donations. They solicited donations, mostly of money, but eventually they used that money to buy and sew clothing for the soldiers in the Continental Navy. She was a close friend of Deborah Franklin Bach. That's not her name. One of Benjamin Franklin's daughters, Bach, I apologize, her first name escapes me. They were very close and friendly and worked together. Eventually, Bach had taken over once Esther Reed dies. She took over as leader of the Ladies Association, and Julia Stockton was a very close associate of hers during this time. Now, Julia Stockton also got married, and she got married to someone we've already spoken about. I told you he'd be back, and it is Dr. Benjamin Rush, another signer of the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Rush, as I said earlier, had been in Europe when he and Richard Stockton convinced John Witherspoon to come over and take over Princeton, this university we keep talking about. He also goes on, and I'm not going to get too into Benjamin Rush here because I have and probably will again make entire videos about Benjamin Rush because he was so important not only to the American founding as a politician, though he didn't vote for independence. He was chosen to replace certain delegates who refused to vote for independence, and he shows up just a few weeks before they signed the document, so he got his name on there, gleefully I might add. He then goes on to play an important role in the war itself, in politics, as a physician. He's on the forefront of mental health. His face is on the logo of the American Psychiatric Association because he is really considered the first American psychiatrist, though he did come up with certain ideas that were not good in hindsight. That being said, he was one of the first people to recommend we treat alcoholism as a disease, we treat mental health as a disease, that we try and reform prisoners instead of simply punish them. He was also very much, and it's not a surprise based on some of the women in his life, that he was uh, thought of women very highly and wanted to see women be treated more equally in society. Furthermore, he was arguably kind of a proto-abolitionist, though again, some of his ideas were backwards. Like uh, he thought black people's skin color was part of a disease that could be cured. He did think they should be treated equally and thought slavery was terrible, but it was because they were really white underneath. Again, not necessarily the best ideas, but he was forward thinking. He was very enlightened for his time, and he was trying to rectify injustices he saw, whether or not his conclusions and decisions regarding how those problems should be rectified were correct. He still was trying to improve society as best he could. After this, we move on to one of their children, actually, Richard Rush. And this guy doesn't get a lot of attention, but Richard Rush actually ends up being really important to the first generation of American founders. He would serve as in the House of Representatives. He ends up being, I believe it was Attorney General. No, not Attorney General. I'm just going to make sure I get it right. He ends up being Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Then he spends 3 years as Attorney General of the United States of America. I was right. It was Attorney General under the end of the James Madison and beginning of the James Monroe presidencies. He's the 8th Attorney General of the United States. He's then chosen to go be, after briefly serving as Secretary of State, he goes to Europe where he replaces John Quincy Adams as the United States Minister to Great Britain. Now, he and John Quincy Adams end up having a very long and important relationship during this time. After 7 years in Great Britain, he returns to the United States to be John Quincy Adams' Secretary of the Treasury for 4 years. And then he kind of retires for almost 20 years before going back to Europe to be Minister to France for 2 years. Just real quick. And then comes back to the United States. So again, this person, Richard Rush, whose father and grandfather both signed the Declaration of Independence, ends up being Attorney General, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, and a real teammate of John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, although he does have teammates during the Monroe presidency, ends up getting into some sticky situations once Andrew Jackson comes around and becomes his enemy. But either way, Richard Rush, a really underappreciated, if not founder, part of that Jacksonian age. He's one of those guys who's like, Andrew Jackson was alive for the revolution, but he doesn't really count. John Quincy Adams, I count him because he was technically a member of the Washington administration. Though so was Andrew Jackson. He was in the House of Representatives during the Washington administration. I'm not going to get off on that tangent. Richard Rush, a really important person. What I will do is continue along to our next person. We're going to bounce back over to the other side of the Stockton family, aka the other side of the Boudinot family, and look at Susan. This is a hard middle name. Boudinot. Susan Vergreau. I don't know. Susan Vergreau Boudinot, she is their child. She ends up, again, getting a really good education for a woman at the time. Susan continues on. She ends up getting married. I am going to talk about her spouse in just a minute, but he passes away fairly early on, and she ends up moving back in with her parents and never remarries. What she's really most famous for is, first of all, apparently she was in New Jersey with the governor of New Jersey. This is a legend. It can't be confirmed. The governor of New Jersey at the time seems to have been William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son. Apparently, as a child, she was supporting the Patriots, and she threw some tea out of the window right in front of the governor just to show how she felt about it. Now, truthfully, this probably speaks more about her parents' opinion, since she was just a child acting on things she heard in the home more than anything else, but it is a very interesting little story for this young woman. As I said, she grows up to get married. When her husband passes away, she moves back in with her parents, spends the rest of her life with her parents, and ends up actually writing and editing and publishing her father's papers when he passed away, Elias Boudinot. So, as a leader of New Jersey, as a president of the Continental Congress, as a commissary of provisions for prisoners during the war, these are extremely important papers, historically speaking, so we have her to thank for that. Now, as I mentioned, she did get married. She married a gentleman named William Bradford. There are so many William Bradfords in American history that I will specify who this one was. This William Bradford was the second Attorney General in the history of the United States. After Edmund Randolph leaves Attorney General to take over for Thomas Jefferson as second Secretary of State, William Bradford is brought in as his replacement as the second Attorney General of the United States, prosecuting the laws of the United States. It's an extremely important position. Unfortunately, he does pass away about 2 years into that office at just 40 years old. And again, that's when Susan is left widowed and she moves back in with her parents for the remainder of her life. And we're going to continue over here with another, quote, child of this particular family, Buck Waddy. Now, Buck Waddy is not actually Elias and Hannah's son. He was a Cherokee Native American who he went by several names. This is his Americanized version of his original name, and the one he's fairly most common associated with, well, after the one I will bring up in a minute, because he goes to Connecticut to a school that's established earlier by Elias Boudinot. Elias had established this school. The exact name eludes me, but it was basically a boarding school for Native American children to learn essentially how to be anglicized. And again, historically, not necessarily everyone's favorite way of going about correcting these issues, but many Native Americans did see the opportunity to learn how to assimilate better into white society as just that, an opportunity. And Buck Waddy was one of these young men. On his way to this school that Boudinot had started, he stops at Boudinot's house because Boudinot was nice to these students and wanted to give them a place to stay on their long, arduous journey, as journeys were at the time. While they're there, they find so many things in common and establish their relationship in just a matter of days, to such a point that Buck Waite asks a favor and Boudinot agrees to the favor. And Buck Waite's favor is, can I change my name? And Boudinot says, yeah, you can absolutely take that name if you want it. And what was the name Waite wanted? Elias Boudinot. He literally changes his name because he has such respect for this man to the same name. Now, I'm not going to get too much into Waddy's career here. He does study. He becomes an important leader of the Cherokee. There are, of course, debates within the Cherokee about whether or not anglicizing and joining the Americans is the right thing or the wrong thing. There are several wars around the issue over the ensuing decades, and that is a little bit out of the purview of this particular conversation. But suffice to say that Elias Boudinot the second, aka Buck Waddy, becomes an extremely important person in the United States at the same time, really between when Rush is important and when Robert F. Stockton becomes important, going over and taking Canada. So this, as you see next to me, is essentially the Stockton-Boudinot connection. I had known that they were connected a little bit, and it wasn't until I put together that they married each other's sisters that I realized, oh, they really are connected, because I had known about the Rush Stockton. They're the only that I am aware of father-in-law, son-in-law team that signed the Declaration of Independence. And yes, they had been married. Actually, Benjamin Rush was engaged to another woman who passed away, and a year and a month later is when he marries Julia, which is just about a year and a half before they signed the Declaration of Independence. So they were already all members of the same family, pretty much. This, not yet. They were still too young. But that is the story of the Boudinots and Stocktons of pretty much New Jersey, though a little bit of Philadelphia too. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, hit like. If you're new here, subscribe for American Revolution, all sorts of American Revolution content all week long.